Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for many, many reasons. Today, with the additional reason that I'm holding my 4-month-old baby. No, this is a special and different one. I'm going to be joined by a brilliant educator that I also happen to be married to, who is coming in. And we're going to talk about the whys and wherefores, but first we'll say hello to Susan Tessers.
Hello.
I got him. He's asleep. He's chilling. So we're doing this today because next Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. Central to 10:30 a.m. Central, Susan and I are going to be doing a webinar, a free webinar. I don't even know if it should be called a webinar because it's on the stream. People can just come. You don't have to register or log in or whatever. But we're going to start doing a series of these at some random intermittent intervals whenever we feel like we have the opportunity and resources. Availability. Called Parenting Through the Pandemic. And we are parents, we're married, we have a 5-year-old who is working on some schoolwork in the other room right there. We have a 4-month-old that's sleeping on me, and we have a 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old that just went out.
2-year-old, almost 3-year-old.
2-year-old, almost 3-year-old. You see why I need, we're partners, not solo. We always talk about, and last week we talked about this a lot in the stream, that context changes and we can't keep doing the same things that worked in the old context. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does. Being a parent in the pandemic has been a challenge, and certainly not one that's unique to us. But we just figured that since we have the lived experience, and also I happen to be an educated and experienced therapist who specializes in neurodiversity and development and all that stuff. And do you want to introduce your own professional background?
Sure. Well, for a long time, I was a primary educator. I taught kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. Then I became a reading specialist and worked with students ranging from kindergarten through 6th grade. And now I am working out of the home.
Yep. I mean, among all the other changes that the pandemic brought on for us, hello there in the chat. And yeah, I didn't give my normal spiel, but this is still what it normally is. We're just having an open conversation. Anybody who's here, you're part of the conversation. If you're in the chat and ask questions or say things, that shapes the conversation. We will be talking about things to start us off, just so that there's not pressure for somebody. But yeah, she's also a curriculum designer and all kinds of, presenter, and she's much more impressive. You're much more impressive than I am on paper. 2 master's degrees, and anyway, we'll have to write up a fancy bio for you when we announce all this and send out the link and everything, like it or not.
Oh boy.
So we just figured between our professional experience and expertise and our lived experience of being parents raising kids during all this, that it would be helpful to open up a conversation for everybody. We're going to present things and talk about things and answer questions, but it's also an opportunity for us to get a sense of other people's experiences too. It's the whole point of all of this. Everything we say every week is that we're all figuring it out as we go along, so we can all learn from each other. I'm off my game because my spiel is different this week. Good work, buddy. You want to do the next one? Good.
Did you do both of your pattern shape ones? Okay. I'll check it and then we'll submit it, okay? You want to go take a break?
Yeah.
Okay.
So part of what we're doing by necessity, but also I think it's a good way to do it, is this. We're home with our kids. We'll be home with our kids. The time for the stream next week is Tuesday morning, 1 second, at 9:30 to 10:30 a.m.
We have a son that is very into football right now and likes to check scores and stats. That is his
You're
chosen
welcome.
break right now.
Yes, he's very into the colors of the uniforms and ranking teams and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so what I was saying was that when when you carried and delivered our almost 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old, that the plan was for you to stop working out at a school or whatever for a school year, to be home, and then go back to working in the schools. Of course, the pandemic hit in the middle of that, and so everything has been adjusted, including that we had a third child, which I can't imagine what being pregnant and delivering a baby during the pandemic was like too. I can imagine from the outside. Yes.
Well, Brandon was very involved. He's not an absentee father in any way, but
yeah. So today we're just partly doing this as an experiment to see what it's like. So how the technology works doing this from home, and to see how well the kids are able to not need us for the entire hour and just check in here and there. And yeah, we're going to have to get up and step away because that's the reality of this situation. You know, again, we're not the only ones dealing with
it's a trial
this.
to see if I pop on camera or if he needs to find somebody else
No,
to
that's not the
replace me.
concern. You're definitely not going to pop, so I don't care about that. We are in Central Time, which I think is GMT -6, I believe. You know, Central Time Zone.
What's GMT?
Greenwich Mean Time. It's like where the international, no, not the international date line, but it's the zero. You know, everything is plus or minus from there. I think it's Greenwich Mean Time.
What time zone? Oh,
Adjusting the angle.
yeah. So it is 1:07 our time.
Oh, that is a much more helpful way to
In
answer
the
question.
afternoon.
But this is exactly the point. I say all the time on the stream, like, oh, I'm very philosophical and I don't always remember to be practical. Well, part of that is because I'm married to somebody who is very practical and helps pull me in that direction, like just happened. I mean, to me, that's fascinating because the way that I think about cognition and stuff, that my attempted solution was to describe the category, whereas you just said, here's what time it is now, compare that to what time it is there now. It's much more practical.
Meantime, in Britain, I live in London. That's why.
Yeah.
Huh.
So this is the chat, Susan, where the people who are here, whether they're on Twitch, Facebook, YouTube, whatever, if you're chatting, we'll see it, and everybody else here in the chat will see it, and we respond to it. We try not to call out people's names just in case people don't want that, because this, after it's done, will also be a VOD on all 3 of those sites, so people can go back and watch it. Susan has watched plenty, but not been on one before, right?
Yep.
I'm talking probably more quietly than usual because I have a baby sleeping on me, so if you have trouble hearing me or Susan, let us know and we'll adjust. But yeah, so we're going to start this series, and the first one next Tuesday is specifically about helping kids with schooling, whether that's in person or remote. There's so much shifting and so much uncertainty. There's people who are temporarily going to be remote and then back to in person, or they've been in person but they're worried they might be remote, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
This next week too, where we'll talk a little bit about learning loss and
yeah, so we're going to talk about education kind of generally in the way that we do, and that'll involve, as we normally do, talking about like the mechanisms behind things and whatever, but also very specific practicals, you know, teaching your kid at home how to set up centers if you have younger, like elementary age kids, or how to support your children with remote learning if they're high schoolers or even college students. If you've got students at home, whatever age, whether they're going to school during the day and then coming home at night, or whether they're at home the whole time, that's what we're going to be talking about next week. And I'll say, just because this question has come up in the past, to be clear, that this hour is still the This Is Not Therapy hour. It's not shifting to a parent-focused thing. That's a separate thing, but for this week, we're talking about it, and we're both here. So we don't even have to focus just on parenting and kid stuff and education today. We'll probably start talking about that stuff, but take us wherever you want us to go, chat. There was one other thing I was going to say before we launched into it. What was it? Oh, the other thing, the last like announcement-y thing. So Cecil's here producing, and Cecil, if you go ahead and put in the chat the links that people can use. So if you're interested, there will be the links, and you can go. It's the same links that you. Well, those are bigger links than I realized. You can go see it, and like I said, it's not a register thing. You don't need to enter information. If you want, you can either subscribe or hit the notification button so that you'll get notifications when it's going live or getting ready to go live. And of course, feel free to share all that stuff out. And then the last thing I was going to say is that because the webinar is only an hour and we're trying to cover a lot, we're going to collect questions during that hour. I'm holding his pacifier in case it just might look weird. He's got one of those little pacifiers that he sometimes spits out. That we'll collect questions during that hour, but probably won't have time to answer them. So next week during the This Is Not Therapy hour time slot, we'll be addressing the questions that we collected during the webinar. But again, that won't be a regular ongoing thing. That's just to make it work for us to be able to cover as much as we're trying to cover. Honestly, people are just kind of in a stressful situation right now. I mean, everybody.
Rex is super stressed right now.
It says Rex is his name. Mm-hmm. The one stream that I've missed since we started doing this, there was 1 week we didn't do a stream, and there was 1 week where we did a stream and I wasn't on it, and that was the week that he was born and we were in the hospital. So I think that's finally enough, all the announcements, right? Mm-hmm. 11 minutes worth, a couple interruptions. What's on your mind right now? That's how all my clients feel. I start almost every session by saying, what do we want to talk about? What's on your mind? Because like we talk about here, that it has to be directed by the person who's the focus of the work. You're not the focus of the work right now.
Good.
Everyone always responds to that question with like, I don't know. Because it's not a question we get asked very often in terms of like literally say anything that you're thinking about. Mostly we look at for what people are asking
mostly
for.
I've just been looking at Rex while you're talking.
That's fair. He's adorable.
Yeah. But also just thinking about, okay, are all 3 boys accounted for and taken care of right now?
Of course it is okay to ask questions about learning and stuff. It's okay to ask questions about literally anything you want to ask questions about. The point of this approach is that the way that we do our work is that it's about being a human, right? So that it applies to any element of that. And there are, I've said before, the more general you are, the more cases in which it applies, but the less impactful it is in each case to which it applies. The more specific, the less frequently it applies, but the more impactful it is. So sometimes it's helpful to be general and just talk about being humans in general. Sometimes we're going to be talking about being parents or helping kids with schooling, or even get narrower into parents of high schoolers or whatever, or talking about people with ADHD or whatever specific subgroups. But yeah, no, nobody has to be any kind of a thing to be here, to be there. The only requirement is that you want to be there or here. So please ask away, because otherwise we'll probably just joke with each other. And a lot of our humor is reference humor, mm-hmm. which is really funny if you watch the same things that we watch. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just funny to us. But it's probably not very funny if you don't watch the same things we watch.
Right. It's more confusing.
Well, let's talk, Susan, while we wait for questions. You mentioned that we're going to talk about learning loss and things like that. Mm-hmm. So why don't we start by talking about that right now, and then questions come up.
So I think like even in normal times, there's a lot of parents that worry that is my student where they need, or is my child where they need to be academically. And obviously like you have this first half of the school year where things are fine, but then as you gear up for the end of the year and preparing for the next grade or the next challenge, it's like, did they accomplish or do what they need to do to be ready for the next grade? So even in normal times, we have a lot of parents that worry about that. But then if you throw in this pandemic where learning either gets interrupted with quarantining or remote learning, then you start to worry even more because you feel like you're the one dropping the ball, or is my child going to suffer because of these transitions and interruptions and stuff. And really, like, I can speak more about, you know, the primary grades and what goes on there. But one of my biggest things, especially with like the young kids, the ones that are in, you know, kindergarten, first, second grade, is you look at this as like a spectrum, right? If my student isn't this level reader by this point in the year, are they behind? A lot of parents wondering if they should get their child a tutor and like, but if you think about it, the kid is in school for 8 hours of the day. And then if you say, okay, now we're going to go to see your tutor, that's, I mean, mostly is just going to, you know, cause them to.
There are hard limits, is what you're saying. That
the brain can only take so much, right? We need breaks.
Finite resources in executive function. There's only so much energy and only so much time and only so much attention and awareness, and spending it on anything means you don't spend it on another thing, and you need to rest, and all the things we talk about. So that exposure to more information is not the thing that is gating any person's ability to absorb and utilize that information. It may be part of the issue, but in order to think of it that way, and this is me getting very philosophical, in order to think of it that way or approach it that way, you have to first start by identifying what information you think is the important information, because everyone is exposed to information at all times. Like, you navigate life, you see things, right? So yeah, overworking people, kids or anybody, is not going to have the result that you want it to have.
I guess when we're talking about learning loss and learning on the spectrum kind of thing, not spectrum as in like, you know, at what point are you going to be able to do one task versus like another kind of spectrum. I just always emphasize that, you know what, like, not every person is going to reach this benchmark or this target at this particular point. And we just kind of need to ease off a little bit and just make sure that, you know, is there growth there? As long as we're seeing growth, as long as we're seeing kids interested in things, that's, you know, the main goal of education. Well, one of the
more important than being able to pass a specific test or recite certain specific information is, do people learn how to learn?
Yeah.
And do they engage with learning in a way that makes them want to continue to do so? So if we engage in processes that make it so that they can ace a particular test, but they hate learning. So as an example, especially for neurodivergent people, how many of you loved reading fiction, especially sci-fi and fantasy, like genre fiction, but how many of you loved reading fiction in middle school and then after high school or after college stopped, you know, during those times stopped reading and never went back to it? Right? That there are processes that take things that we love and destroy them, turn them into things that we don't love anymore. But yeah, learning loss specifically, it was, the concept originally was more about, I guess, loss in the sense of like backsliding, kind of like
in the summer, particularly.
Right, the things you had learned, and then time passes, particularly over the summer, and you lose some of the stuff that you've learned. But the pretty like tricky and insidious thing right now, I think, is that a lot of people are using that phrase to mean lost potential learning, right? That we're talking about learning loss sometimes not as something you used to know and now forgot, but instead, what learning would you be doing in some other environment, in some other context that you're not doing, and therefore you're losing out on that, which is an insidious way to talk about it, because it's indefinable, and literally no matter what you're doing, you can always talk about what other things you could be getting instead. The point is, all of these developmental milestones, like everything we talk about all the time, that research is great and useful and valid. There's a reason that we do it. It is not a roadmap for any individual's life. It's statistical findings. What we're saying is, normally, meaning most commonly, kids seem to be able to do this at about this time. But the way that the school system is set up, and this isn't intrinsic to education generally, but it's certainly true of the school system we have in the United States and many others. It's a ranking system. Yeah, I want to get to that question for sure. So that pulls parents in, right? That if the point of grades in school is to compare and theoretically someday try to get into college because you have better grades, it's a competition, it's a ranking system. And parents get pulled into that idea of, uh-oh, if my kid is not doing well, they're falling behind, right? Which isn't even something that the concept of ahead or behind doesn't apply to development unless what you're trying to do is rank children against each other, which is inherently problematic. But I'm getting philosophical and we should be practical.
Yeah, let's look at some of these questions.
I worry a lot about how difficult it is for me to work without interacting with other people. Ooh, that's a good question. A huge struggle for most of my life. Do you find kids are often like that? How do you help kids to take things on their own? How do you and kids approach problems like that?
I mean, just through experience as a teacher, like some kids do work better when they're working with others and feeding off of each other's ideas, and other kids obviously prefer to kind of do things a little more independent.
Yeah, so there's variation, and we could talk about what variations between or among people, from person to person might impact what things. Of course, my first thought with a question like that is, I feel like you're going to internally roll your eyes at me because I'm going so philosophical.
I'll make sure it's only internal.
is the premise that we're not questioning there, which is it beneficial for somebody to do something independently? Is that something that we should be striving for? How are we meant to operate? A lot of the time when people are struggling with kind of the more intractable problems like this, it often turns out that what they're aiming to do, what they're intending to do, is actually not a thing that anybody does or can do, but that the individual thinks that other people not only can do it, but expect them to do it as well. And so then they spend so much of their resources trying to do something. So independent learning, I kind of want you to help me pull this into like practical education stuff, because otherwise I'm going to talk about mimesis and desire. Right? Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about like my classroom and the way that a lot of the education and different curriculum programs are headed. And there is still like the independent components, like a writing piece or whatever. But within the process of writing something, there's conferencing with the teacher, there's conferencing with your peers, there's constant revisions and stuff that goes on based on how your conferences with your teacher and peers went. So even though it's technically your piece of writing, it's your thoughts and ideas down on paper or on the computer, you still get the feedback and the knowledge of others around you. Same thing when you're reading. Like a lot of times, like especially in like the primary grades and stuff, a lot of the strategy approach lessons, you're working with a small group that all the students in that group are working on a similar strategy, like whether it's the strategy is how to pull out a main idea from a text or whatever. You're still working with a group of people because you need that support when you're trying to get stronger or better at a task. Basically, is that learning on your own is not only
it's impossible.
Yeah.
Because existing on your own is impossible.
Right.
And of course, there are specific things I'm assuming that you are noticing in your life that you want to be different. And it may not be helpful for us to say like, oh no, you can't, so please clarify, help us to be more specific. But yeah, this is one of those things that the current structure of the school system emphasizes that I think is kind of inappropriate or harmful. The idea that being able to do something independently and quickly, that those are the two metrics that matter in terms of mastery. That everything about grades and tests and all of that kind of stuff, the premise there is you need to acquire and retain knowledge and then know how to apply it on your own without any help, because any help would be cheating, right? But nothing gets done that way. Nothing gets done that way. Nobody lives in isolation. Even if you want to say like, I do everything on my own, well, okay, but you probably didn't grow all your own food and sew all your own clothes. We don't even know what we would be aiming for if it wasn't for communicating with other people and existing within community. So that's why I start there, because obviously there are other questions, and please help guide us to those specific questions. But generally, that's one of those, I call it missing the wink. You've heard me talk about this, right? That there are so many things that we say, like our culture says, with a wink, like When you're at work for 8 hours a day, you got to work that whole time, and nobody does that because you can't do that. It's not how the human brain works. So we're saying it, but we're winking. We're like, we all know this isn't real. Except sometimes people miss the wink and they just hear the phrase and think that's what they're supposed to do. And this is one of those things. You should work independently, be able to figure things out on your own. How would you? There's only two ways to get information, either from experience, you try things and observe what happens, right? Or through communication with other people. And sometimes that's because they wrote something in a book and sometimes they're talking to you, whatever. But
And I think often you have students or people in the workplace that are the more quiet participants, right? You might assume that they would prefer to work by themselves because they're not offering a lot. They're not vocalizing a lot to the group, but they're still picking up on the data around them and what coworkers or other students or teachers are saying. And they might be developing their own thoughts and ideas, internally. So even though you might think somebody needs to be more of an independent learner or worker, they still, we all need to work together and thrive from learning from one another.
Yeah. And frankly, this is more of a problem for people who are what we would call more intelligent, I suppose. And I don't like that way of looking at things, but that's what we're talking about a lot with education is intelligence, that you should be able to think about it and figure it out on your own. When really that's the most inefficient way to do things. So thank you for the clarification that it would be more productive to work with other people, but it's never been an option. Maybe it would be more useful to talk about restructuring. Of course, it is without new pacifier. Restructuring your life to include people in your work, even when you live and work independently. And that is a great question, especially in the context of what we're discussing and the shifts between in person and remote, which is a hot topic, not just in education, obviously, but in work. And that is a really good and important thing to explore, that how do we restructure things to get what we still need in the new context? In this particular case, working with other people, communicating with other people. And of course, it varies group to group and person to person, but maybe we can talk a little bit about starting with our experience with our kids and how they've been able to work with people, and then talk more about.
And just to clarify, are they referring to working with people in person, or can it be working with people virtually?
So while you answer that question in the chat, if you're comfortable, I'll point out that what just happened right here is an excellent example of what we're discussing. That in order to navigate the world, you have to make assumptions, right? And I made assumptions about what that question meant. I interpreted it in a way that I assumed was the correct interpretation, and would never have known to open that up and ask and clarify that particular piece of it unless somebody else, in this case Susan, or maybe if it had been a problem that you in the chat could have clarified for me. But until somebody else says, hey, did you think about this piece? No, I didn't. And I literally can't until somebody else gives me a reason to. So clarify that, but we'll talk about some generic. And of course, the big one is, what we're doing right now, video chatting, right? That we're using that as effectively the best replacement we can come up with for in-person. And it's not the same, and we know that, and it misses things. But I think there's opportunity here to explore. There are always trade-offs, and it doesn't mean that any two things are equally valuable and whatever. Things are better suited and worse suited for different things. But there's advantages of remote work, as well as the disadvantages of you might guess that we didn't get great sleep last night or any night with 3 young children. There's advantages and disadvantages, which also means that it's going to be better suited for some people, for some tasks, in some contexts, and worse suited for others. So that's one of the big mistakes that people are making, especially right now, is to assume that because it's more difficult for you to work on, to do remote learning, for example, that it must be more difficult for other people as well. That's not always true. I've been co-working on Zoom with a friend for a few hours every day lately, which helps a lot. Yeah. So I'll talk philosophy a little bit, and then we can do some practical. What we're talking about is mimesis. I like to talk about sensitivity to social data. It's also called reality checking. That when I come up with an idea, I have no way of knowing. None of us have any way of knowing whether or not that idea is a good one, a useful one, until we put it out into the world and test it. And we can either do that by using it to do whatever the idea was to do, or by sharing it with someone else and getting their thoughts and opinion and feedback on it, and then modifying from there, right? So when you're sensitive to social data, I mean, which we all are, just some are more and some are less, right? That other people's communication to you, and you might be interpreting it correctly and you might not be, which is an important caveat. It guides a lot, right? When someone says something like, I don't want to do this, but I'm doing it because they want me to do it. Well, that means that you want to do it because you want to do what they want you to do for whatever reason, right? It means I don't enjoy this thing in and of itself. I wouldn't otherwise do it, but I'm doing it because it'll make that person think of me in some kind of a way that I want them to think of me, or impact them in some other way. So you do want it, just for different reasons. So co-working on Zoom, this is in the same realm as body doubling, that there's data, theoretically, there's communicative data that we can't necessarily pinpoint and isolate and call out. People will talk about it as like vibes and energy and whatever kind of thing. If someone else around you is working, it's easier for you to work. Basically that. If someone else around you is doing something, it's easier for you to do that thing. Usually procrastinate on homework until like 2 a.m. They got everything done once I stressed enough. That's an important and good one to shift into. But first I want to do more practical stuff about the like working remotely or learning remote. Like, how do we communicate and keep in touch with other people when we're not in the same physical location?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak for like our oldest son who's in kindergarten. So the teacher will send out like a weekly update to the parents and go subject by subject and say what the main objectives are for the week. And just because of my background, I can say, great, I can do this activity, and this activity to reach these goals here. But for a parent that's not, doesn't have that background, it's more complicated. And the teacher, when he has students quarantining or whatever, can send out more detailed plans or more activities. He just can't do that unless other students.
Yeah, we have a very interesting policy in our school district.
I was like, how much do I explain here?
We are voluntarily keeping our children
Yes.
out of school right now because we have the privilege and the means to be able to do so, although it's difficult, and we are not comfortable with the level of risk that they'd be exposed to. Not everyone has that option, but our school district,
especially with having 2 unvaccinated kids at this point.
Our school district has a policy that if you're voluntarily keeping your children out, that the teachers are not allowed to support you in certain ways. Honestly, we probably shouldn't say some of this stuff for fear of getting him in trouble. But, since he has to do it for quarantine people, where he's not only allowed but required to, it's easy to just add us onto the email.
Yeah.
When that happens.
But the different apps and things on our son's iPad help us to, like, when we do an activity at home, we take a quick picture of it. He can do a voice recording. We could do a video of him doing an activity and send it into the teacher. And then using that, the teacher sends back feedback. And so in that sense, even though Miles isn't in school doing the work by the teacher can still see how he's progressing with different things. And then I guess I would say in the workplace, like, I was maybe going to go back to work at a different school I had worked at in the city the first year of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And do just some like remote like reading groups, because the school was going to be learning remotely. I think they did the whole year of remote learning. So they were going to have me do some like Zoom reading support for some of their 3rd and 4th graders. It didn't end up happening just because of, trying to get organized and figure out teaching remotely for that school. It was a lot of work. But, when you're sitting there thinking about like, okay, how am I going to do this task for my job? And you're thinking about it on your own. And I've been the only person fulfilling that role in the school. It feels so lonely, and you feel like all of a sudden you feel unsure of yourself, and am I qualified to do this? Am I going to be doing more harm than good? Like kind of stuff. But then as soon as I would get on a Zoom call with a coworker of mine and start talking about ideas and stuff, all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, I do have some background in this. I do have expertise in this. It's going to look different because of our situation, but you can still, figure out a way. So having that partner or group of people to bounce ideas off of and feel like you're not out there alone.
Yeah, and this could go in a lot of different directions. We could talk about why diversity is not a charitable thing. It's an important and beneficial thing, because you had to reinvent yourself. I mean, that's what we're doing, right? Like all of us all the time, having to figure out how to do whatever we're trying to do in the new context. But yeah, the short and pithy way to say it is, you can come up with new applications of information. Any information you have in your head, you can break it apart and recombine it and pull other things from memory and whatever, but you can't make new information in your head. So as soon as you start working with somebody else, whether it's over discussion like that, or just kind of observation in a co-working situation or whatever, that they're presenting data to you that gives you new stuff to work with, new combinations. You can point out one thing and all of a sudden, it's a trope, right? They're like, wait a second, say that again. You're a genius. Like aha moment. But it's a trope because it happens. It's like, wait, this one thing that I hadn't considered, and now I'm applying it over here. So some practical things, right? That if we're talking about, looking at co-working as body doubling basically is one way of talking about this. It's easier to work when someone else is working. It's easier to do art when someone else is doing art, whatever. But one is what Susan's talking about, which we're sharing information and communicating with each other, that I'm testing theories against you and you're testing them against me, and we come to some conclusion together. Another way of talking about it, and school fulfills this role a lot, is what we call culture, basically, which is having certain touch points that everybody has together. That if we make every single kid learn what a cumulonimbus cloud is, which seems like unnecessary information for the most part.
Very specific example.
Or that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, like whatever. It's not really necessarily relevant, but it does keep people generally in a community. That makes it easier for us to communicate with one another because we have similar reference points. And another one that's beneficial about working with other people is establishing aims, that not only about how do we go about doing what we're trying to do, but the question of what is it that we're trying to do. Well, I can have all kinds of ideas about that, but I literally can't know what any of those ideas, if they sound interesting or beneficial to anyone but me, unless I talk with somebody else and we get consensus. So there's value in these things. There you go. And so I'm pointing that out because what we could do is we can take something, and this is kind of across the board, especially in the pandemic, you can take something and break it down into its component parts. What are the different things that it accomplishes for you, and replace it piecemeal? Because it's going to be very unlikely to come up with something that's going to fulfill the exact same role in the same way to the same extent, just one for one. Mm-hmm. But if you break it down and say, well, this part of it's important, how can I get that? This part of something like going to the gym, well, the working out might be part of what is important to it, but also the getting out of the house and away from everybody for a second, and putting in your music and kind of shutting out the world and the energy and activity. You come in with different theories about what elements are important, and replace them one at a time as best you can in the context. That still wasn't very practical.
So what do you?
Video calls, Discord communities, Twitter, social media of any kind, and just keep the general rule in mind that finite resources. So if I'm paying attention to 1,000 people, or I'm paying attention to 10 people, well, I can't pay very close attention to 1,000 people if I'm paying attention to all of them. And if I am only paying attention to 10 people, I can pay really close attention to them. That's honestly part of what's so interesting about parenting is it, for me at least, I won't speak universally, but I think this is a common experience, that I have never spent so many of my resources on an individual as I do for each individual one of my children. I think about them more. I base more of what I do and don't do and structure our house and our life around them. It's 1:40, and there were some other questions, so let me call them out, those other questions. Because one was, I mentioned the reading thing, and somebody in chat said that my son would do better if he was reading more, but he's not.
Well, you say loses interest in books. Is it just the book format, or is it any type of reading? Did you see that one?
He needs to read more, but he loses interest in books. So again, actually, this
any type of
dovetails
reading. Okay.
with what we were just talking about, and I'm going to pass.
ADD.
I'm going to pass this mostly to Susan because she is a reading specialist with a whole master's in it and whatever. But same concept, that we take a general thing like reading and we can break it down into components. And so, for example, he does well when he reads more books. Okay. But what element of that is important? Is it the physical act of reading? Because in that case, reading articles or texts or tweets or any other thing is also a physical act of reading. Is it about the narrative? And if so, does a video game have the same narrative structure and provide the same value? Is it about X, Y, and Z? And they're all theories, but that we want to be able to get more granular. And I can talk more about the ADHD piece, but maybe let's pass over to the reading specialist to talk about reading and the processes behind it and why someone might go from loving reading to not liking it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I feel guilty about sometimes is, finding the time of the day to show my kids that I'm a reader, because sometimes it's having that model, that example around you, seeing like, oh, mom and dad are really enjoying that book or reading that magazine or whatever. And seeing that example, that model of what it means to be a reader. But in this case, I would say I worked at a school that had the most amazing librarian. Whatever the kids were interested in, she knew exactly the right kind of text or thing to point them to. And, there would be parents who were like, oh, my child's reading too many graphic novels, or my child is only reading fiction and not nonfiction. But everybody has, something that they gravitate more towards. I mean, if I'm going to get Brandon to read something, I better find some sort of really awesome fantasy book for him. And for me, I want to read, a good fiction book, which Brandon says I tend to gravitate more towards ones that he's like, why do you read ones that scare you?
Well, because it's a lot of fad book. Fad's not the right word, but very popular, Man Called Ova and Girl on the Train,
oh yeah,
Oprah Book Club style.
Yeah, those aren't really Oprah, but yeah. So I would say that whatever he's bored with or losing interest in, what are his interests? Is there some way to incorporate that into his reading? If he's interested in sports, there's tons of sports books, or both fiction and nonfiction. If he likes reading about stats or teams or whatever, if he's into art, there's so many awesome graphic novels where the illustrations just grab you. I mean, it's kind of finding his interest and trying to have the reading meet that. Yeah.
Engage in areas of interest is always a good and important. I mean, the best learning happens when people engage with things that they're interested in, because they have a larger scheme. Manga, yes. And really, there was an XKCD, it's a webcomic. There was a comic a long time ago that I think about. Oh, he answered it for you. We're on stream, Anita. We'll call you back. Do you want me to take him?
Yeah, I think so.
That I thought illustrated this point beautifully, where it was talking about, is people, are kids texting so much, is that going to ruin their ability to write and read and whatever? So the thought experiment that the comic proposed was, imagine a society where people walk around with balls all the time, a ball, a baseball or whatever, and they're constantly just playing around with it, throwing it to each other, throwing it up in the air. They're not following any rules or learning how to do it properly. They just have it and they're messing around with it. Do you think that if you tried to teach somebody like that how to play baseball later on in life, that they would be better equipped or less well equipped to learn that because of all the unstructured play they've been doing with it? So if we're talking about reading as language development, reading as an intellectual skill, and it's an important one, then reading of any kind is beneficial in that way. It doesn't have to be books. Hello, you're waking up. Yes, cute noises. We've got 14 more minutes, buddy. Yeah, so I'll keep checking in with you while we finish up, right? Yes. Now, I'll say I mentioned that particular thing because it is a very common process that people have a love of reading and lose it. And part of that, different theories, right? Everyone has different theories, but here's one. Big smile. He's like right about to learn to laugh, so he's very good at getting my attention. Different theories about that, but one is that it basically, it restructures your approach to reading books from something that is discovery based, right? Experiential, that I'm just doing a thing with no knowledge or framework about how it works or why. And then when you learn all the stuff that they teach you, at least here in English class in high school, it turns it into an intellectual exercise as opposed to an experiential one. That by teaching fiction as basically code, it then becomes difficult to read the fiction without looking at it as code and decoding it instead of just experiencing it and enjoying it. So you want to liberate that up. And you can do that in different ways, try different things. But, oh, buddy. You want me to pass it right back? But one, referencing back what we were saying earlier, is a book club.
Oh, yeah.
Within the context of your family, like if you start reading a book and get a copy for him as well, if there are other people in your family and they're also reading it, whether you structure it and make it a thing that we all have to do or not, just make it available. And as you talk about and engage with the book, it's going to naturally draw their interest towards it enough to make it, I don't know, but
Yeah. One of the things in the classroom that I like to do, and that I saw a lot of teachers doing, was when a kid would finish a book, if they liked it, they would fill out a recommendation form. And then when kids are looking for new books, they could pull out the recommendation or leaf through whatever, however you choose to display it. And in that sense, there's a lot of peer pressure kind of but there's kids in the class that you just gravitate towards and you see, hey, that kid who I think is pretty cool is reading that book. Maybe I should try it
So you make the experience more valuable because, if I have the information in there, then that enables me to engage in this conversation or whatever other kind of thing. And as always, you want somebody to do something, make it more valuable and or less costly. You want them to do less of something, make it more expensive and or less valuable to them. So even things like just having books laying around, doing library runs and saying, hey, you're coming with me. I know you don't want to get a book, but I'm going to get some books and you can just hang out while I do it. Well, they're more likely to see things they might be interested in. And then following things by content. You mentioned manga there. So talking about what kinds of things they're interested in. You can find correlations, right? That if there are certain games that they like, well, that might equate and correlate to certain kinds of books or manga or whatever.
Our son is getting into Minecraft right now, and there are obviously books that teach kids how to be in creative mode, how to be more, how to build certain things. But then they've also got leveled readers now with stories in the Minecraft world. So I'm sure there's a ton of
Yeah, and this transitions into, there's another great question here. I have many executive functioning skills that I need to help my child with. Do I focus on one at a time? And if so, which one would you focus on first? So I would say, generally speaking, no, don't focus on one at a time, especially for someone who's not, no, I got it, sorry. Especially for someone who's doing it with not a client, like our executive functioning coaches, it's more structured and things like that. But if you're trying to support your child or spouse or friend or whatever, the way that executive functioning problems are broken down, or executive functioning itself is broken down, varies from expert to expert. So to say that initiation, for example, is a skill, well, I would disagree with that, even though most executive functioning people would say initiation is a skill. So trying to isolate it that way is muddy and difficult. Instead, if what you're looking at is executive functioning skills, again, as always, like I mentioned before, first you want to clarify what it is that you're trying to do. What is, in other words, poor executive functioning is not in and of itself a problem. There's something that is meant to be happening, or meant to be happening in a certain way that isn't, or something that shouldn't be happening that is. And then the theory is that whatever that is that's happening that shouldn't, or whatever, is happening because of an executive functioning issue. So
I want to play football right now.
Okay, well, we're almost done. Thank you. Read all night by flashlight. Oh, that's right. The homework at 3 a.m. I'll say something about that before we end up. So no, I wouldn't try to address one executive functioning issue at a time. What you do is engage in areas of interest like we're talking about, and try to structure those things in ways that you can map across to whatever the problem area is. So if they're struggling with executive functioning, if the theory that they're struggling with executive functioning arose out of, for example, difficulty doing homework on time, then the goal is we want to get homework done on time. And how we get there, call it improving executive functioning, but what specific thing we do to improve the executive functioning doesn't matter as long as it equates to that thing happening, right? And so we structure it. We talk about, if I think my theory that the reason they're struggling with homework is because they're drained at the end of the day and they're not managing their energy well, that they don't have enough to get through the day and then come home and do work. Well, then we look at restructuring the day, or on a weekend, we start working on, being able to engage in something for a longer and longer period of time, endurance training, but we do it with something that's interesting. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I say it more pithy a lot of the time with people, that working on developing a skill that you don't have an intrinsic interest in developing sucks. It's not fun. You can be made to do it, but it's very inefficient even if you're forced to do it. And so if we're going to try and ask somebody to work on developing their executive functioning, then let's at least do it within the concept, the structure of something that they like. Because you can't isolate executive functioning from doing something. It's the set of skills that enable us to do a thing. So we have to pick what thing. Might as well pick something that we enjoy. I've worked with clients on starting their YouTube channels, or, whatever, making machinima or a comic or whatever. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah, there's a reason that schools are organized by content, and there's problems with that. But there's a reason that classes are, English and math and whatever, instead of task initiation and prioritization and whatever. Because these executive functioning skills, they're helper skills. You use them to be able to do some specific domain-specific thing. We have 6 minutes left, so
You wanted to talk about the 3 a.m.
Yeah, thank you. The 3 a.m. thing, and then somebody again said, reading all night by a flashlight. The truth is, we don't know why or how, but we have very good evidence to support the idea that people work better on different schedules. Some people, their optimal time for working is late at night, and I have theories about why, but that doesn't matter right now. That we're often equating correlation with causation mistakenly, meaning that I come home, I think I should do homework right away, and I don't. But because I think I should, I start to stress and get nervous and beat myself up in my head. And the more time passes, the worse and worse and worse and worse that gets. And then at 10 o'clock, I do my homework. And I come away from that experience, having done that over and over again, I come away saying, oh, I ended up doing it at 10 because I was stressed and beat the crap out of myself in my head. It had to be so painful that I would finally be willing to do it. Well, here's an alternative potential explanation is I get home and I'm drained and I have no energy because I've just been at school all day, so I can't do the homework. And because I think I'm supposed to, and I try to force myself to, I'm not engaging in all the restful and restorative activities that I could do instead to get that energy back and be able to do it. And then when 10 o'clock rolls around, just because of how my biology works, it's a time that I start to get more energized for whatever reason I think it might happen. And so then I'm able to do it. That it's not because I'm stressing that I do it at 10. And there's an easy way to test this theory, which is to say, stop asking yourself to do it at 4. Notice when you do it and try and get yourself as best you can to say, okay, that's when I do it anyway. So now I'm going to aim to do it then, and I'm not going to beat myself up in between. And see, do you still do it at 10? Because if so, I guess the stress wasn't that important, right? And if not, maybe it was right. Maybe it is stress and we try something else. Actually, I just saw a tweet today where it was like one of those dialogue ones, and it said God saying, all right, I made half of you work best during the day and half of you work best during the night so that you guys will be safe at all times. Somebody's looking out. And then culture responding by saying, cool, so we'll make all the people who work best at night wake up in the morning anyway. No, you guys aren't getting it. Yeah, this will be great. We'll make them wake up early. They'll be exhausted and miserable, but we'll all be together. If you work best at night, if you like reading at night, if you like doing homework at night, do it unless it causes a problem. I'd love to know more, hopefully, in a future video about how we can engage our children in school when the majority of the classes are disinteresting. That is a very good question.
Who were we just talking to about this? Where I was talking about how, having the frank conversation with students of like, look, you might not be interested in this particular subject, but somewhere in this classroom there's someone that finds this fascinating. And how do we convince students that we're learning this because we want to throw a bunch of, different content out there to see what sticks. And I forget who I was talking about this, but
yeah, we will talk about that more in depth in another video because we're going to wrap up. But I'll say briefly that what education should be, I think, it serves many rules, right? But generally, like the approach I think that would be best is, here, everybody, this is the information that we collectively as humans have agreed upon is like the best we've come up with so far. So we're going to teach it to you so you don't have to go rediscover it yourself, right? So that instead of having to waste your time rediscovering it, you can go improve on it, come up with new and better stuff, find the problems here, right? That's what it should be. But instead, it gets put out as, here's the stuff that is important for you to know. And if you don't know it, you're bad in some way and you will fail and have a miserable life. And I don't know, put anybody in any situation where you're saying, hey, this stuff that isn't interesting to you and you see no real connection to any like real application, just trust us, it's important, and make yourself learn it anyway. Even if you trust me and do it, it's incredibly inefficient and painful. So like the best tip, honestly, about how to parent is just remember that children are people, and imagine how you would feel if you were in the situation that you're putting your child in. If you're talking about limiting their screen time to 10 minutes a day or whatever, imagine how you would feel if you really enjoyed something, really wanted to do it, and somebody from the outside was only letting you do it 10 minutes at a time. How would that affect you? Thank you. We appreciate you being here. It's fun having you here.
Yeah. I remembered who I was talking to, Mike from Fusion Academy.
Oh, yeah.
He's like, we're not seeing anyone right now. Who did I have a conversation
Mike Wayne from
with?
Fusion. Yeah, we're talking to him
about engaging students. Yeah.
There's nothing like wrong with the intent, with that. That's why things like education are so sticky and problematic, is because at the core, it's just like how lies that are built on a grain of truth are the trickiest ones. Like at the core of it, yeah, these are good things we're attempting to do. And then we've built it into this system that involves all kinds of terrible things. And then we as parents don't know what things matter for what reasons. It all ends up just using grades and, teacher approval and whatever as like a substitute interim for it matters because of your grade.
Which we never looked at Miles's report card from November.
Why would I care?
I know.
Why would I care what my kindergartner's report card is? I don't even care what my high school or college age kid is. And again,
He doesn't have a high school or college age child.
No, I do not. And there's privilege involved in that, where for other people, especially at the high school age, you're worried about earnings and scholarships and things like that. But no, they don't mean anything intrinsically. That's the key with the learning loss is even if it's true, and it is, right? The research shows most kids learn to do this at about this age. Even if that's true, it doesn't mean that that's a good thing to do or a bad thing to not know it by that age. It just means what happens most of the time. But when you don't know any of that stuff, all you can do is look at it and say, well, everybody else is doing it and I'm not, or everybody else is doing it and my kid is not. So that seems like it's probably bad, I guess. All this, throughout this whole thing, we've been talking about basically mimesis, that what you want more or less is a collection of what everybody around you seems to want for you or whatever. Anyway, we got to wrap up. But this was fun.
Yeah.
We will be doing this. Cecil, we post the links again. We'll be doing the webinar next Tuesday, 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. Central Time. And then next week at this same 1 to 2 p.m. on Wednesday.
Did you say 9 to 10?
So 9:30 to 10:30.
9:30 to 10:30.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then next Wednesday, 1 to 2 p.m. during this time is when we'll be addressing the questions that we collect during the webinar. So thank you for being here with us. Thank you. Thank you, Miles. And yeah, hope to see a bunch of you next Tuesday and next Wednesday as well. Please feel free to contact us. Our website's effectiveartistry.com. We do free consultations. There's information there, blah, blah, blah. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.